now.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening to all our panelists and audience members. I'll switch off my phones and I'll ask everybody else to do that as well, please. Before we begin, I'd like to ask Sheikh Ishaq Jashad to begin the proceedings with a short recitation of the Quran. And just to inform everybody, we do have British Sign Language interpreters who will be with us tonight. Sheikh Ishaq, over to you.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody.
Wa alaikum assalam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا وإذا جاءهم أمر من الأمن أو الخوف أذاعوا به ولو ردوه إلى الرسول وإلى أولي الأمر منهم لعلمه الذين يستنبطونه منهم ولولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته لاتبعتم الشيطان إلا قليلا صدق الله العظيم. My dear respected brothers and sisters and viewers, Assalamu alaikum, the greetings of love and mercy. Just a quick overview of the verses I have recited from Surah An-Nisa, verse 82 and 83, in light of the context of today's important topic. This verse tells us that hearsay should not be repeated without prior investigation into its credibility, which is obviously the main focus of the event and the Center for Media Monitoring as well. In a hadith, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, clearly mentions for a man to be a liar, it is enough that he repeats everything he hears without first verifying its truth. And I think looking at the situation with the media today, we see this is the very case where lies are being spread, not just within the Muslim community, but regarding issues which have no truth whatsoever. And also in another hadith, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, also mentions, whoever relates something he thinks is a lie, then he too is one of the two liars. So we have to be very careful as Muslims. I always teach my students and my congregation to always verify the authenticity of the actual matter before spreading the news. And we know one WhatsApp sent within one WhatsApp group reaches the entire world within seconds. So I pray that the Almighty blesses this event, and I'm sure the panelists will cover this in more detail. And I truly applaud and commend the Muslim Council of Britain and the Center for Media Monitoring for doing fantastic work, especially to Sister Amanda and Sister Rizwana and the rest of the team. I wish you all the very best. Have a blessed evening, and I hope you enjoy the event. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you, Sheikh, very much for that apt reminder of the responsibilities we all have when disseminating news. I would like to thank you all for joining this panel discussion that the Centre for Media Monitoring is having on its latest report, which is How the British Media Reports Terrorism. We're delighted to have such a distinguished panel of experts. We will be joined by John Snow very shortly. He's been on air and I know is on his way home to catch up with us, but I'll give him a brief introduction even though he doesn't need much. He began reporting for ITN in 1976 from Africa, the Middle East, Europe and America, and he's covered major news stories including the fall of Idi Amin in Uganda, the Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the release of Nelson Mandela and his inauguration as president. And I always remind John that he and I were in the square in Pretoria together, celebrating as the new South African flag went up after the inauguration. As anchor of Channel 4 News, he's been honoured with the BAFTA Fellowship and has won the Royal Television Society's Presenter of the Year Awards in 2003 2007, 2009, 2011, 2012, and I'm sure those won't be the last. Our next panelist is Rohit Kachru, who very kindly wrote the foreword to our report, and so is very familiar with it. He's the security editor for ITV News, reporting on national security and counterterrorism, both in the UK and around the world. In February, he was named Specialist Journalist of the Year by the Royal Television Society for his work reporting on the territorial defeat of ISIS, or as we like to call Daesh, and its human consequences. He's also reported extensively on the rise of the British extreme right wing. Next, we have Frank Gardner, who is the BBC's full-time security correspondent, reporting for TV, radio, and online on a wide range of international security stories. He graduated in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Exeter University and has lived and worked in Cairo, Dubai, and Bahrain. In 2004, he was sadly shot 6 times by Al-Qaeda gunmen while reporting from Saudi Arabia, and his cameraman was killed. He's been awarded the OBE from the Queen for his services to journalism. Lizzie Dearden is the Independent's Home Affairs and Security Correspondent. Lizzie has reported on ISIS/Daesh since its formation and published one of the first interviews with a returned foreign fighter in 2016. She's covered international terror attacks and has focused on the UK since taking up her current role in 2017. Lizzie covers all forms of extremism affecting Britain, including the emerging far-right movements. Next, we're very delighted to have Dr. Jessica White, who is a fellow researcher at RUSI in the Terrorism and Conflict Group. And I hope Jessica doesn't mind letting everyone know, but Jessica hasn't been feeling well today and she's kindly joined, but she will probably only be with us for the first hour, as will Frank, who's got prior commitments. Jessica conducts research on a range of topics, including the extreme right wing and terrorism in the media and online. She recently published a paper on terrorism and the mass media as part of the ongoing RUSI project, and the second phase of this research, for which will be forthcoming in the next few months. And we also are joined by Professor Paul Spoonley, all the way from New Zealand. So a very good morning to you, Professor Paul Spoonley. Paul is one of New Zealand's leading academics and a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. He was until recently the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Massey University and was granted the title of Distinguished Professor in 2013. He's authored or edited 27 books, and he's currently writing a book on the extreme right in New Zealand and has studied far-right movements globally for decades now. And last but not least, our very own Faisal Hanif, who is not only the author of the report we're discussing tonight, but he's also the media analyst for Centre for Media Monitoring. Faisal is a journalist who has worked as a reporter on The Times and as a researcher at the BBC. He's also conducted field research for 2 national think tanks, the Institute of Public Policy Research and the University of Oxford Centre on Migration Policy and Society. My name is Rizwana Hamid, although within the media industry, I'm better known as Rizu. I'm the director of the Centre for Media Monitoring, and I've worked in print, radio, and television for over 3 decades now, mostly as a producer director for the BBC in news, current affairs, documentaries, and religious programming. I've covered, I won't go into all my details, but I've covered many wars in Africa, you know, the Gulf War, Perestroika, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of apartheid in South Africa, as well as the genocide in Rwanda for Panorama, for which my team received a Royal Television Award and an Amnesty International Award. I'll just give you a very brief overview of Centre for Media Monitoring so that we can then get stuck into the discussion. CFMM was set up in 2018 by the Muslim Council of Britain, which is one of the largest Muslim umbrella organisations representing over 500 affiliate organisations, which include mosques, charities, educational institutions, women's organisations and young people, amongst others. The CFMM's role is to monitor the media on its reporting of Muslims and Islam and to promote more accurate and responsible journalism. We pride ourselves on constructive engagement, and to date we have engaged with all executive editors, managing editors, as well as hundreds of journalists, regulators, politicians, community organizations, as well as media campaign groups as well. Apart from submitting complaints that we find on almost a daily occurrence, we also produce reports, hold roundtable discussions, and submit oral and written evidence to parliamentary inquiries and consultations. We also train Muslim organizations, because we don't think that onus only falls on the media, that Muslim community also has its share in changing the narrative. And so we run workshops on how to write press releases, how to get interviews, how to crisis manage if you come on the spotlight, as how to monitor and make complaints. You can find out more details about us on our website, which is cfmm.org.uk, and you can follow us on social media at CFMM UK. Before we begin our panel discussion, we're very honoured to have Yasmin Qureshi, MP for Bolton South East. She currently serves as the Shadow Minister for International Development. Alongside her frontbench work, she chairs a number of all parliamentary groups, including the APPG on religion in the media, a cross-party group which works to promote religious literacy in print and broadcast media. Yasmin is very familiar with CFMM's work and this report, and would just like to say a few words. Over to you, Yasmin.
Unmute and start my video.
Yes, please.
It's not working. I pressed start, but I think at your other end, they need to allow me in.
Amanda?
Yeah, they've got to.
My sanitizer.
We've got John there.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, John. We're just, I'm going to be coming to you soon. We've just got Yasmin Qureshi, MP, who's just going to give a short contribution.
What an honour.
Very short contribution. Firstly, thank you so much for having me here, Rizwana. And as Rana mentioned, I'm the chair of the All Parties Parliamentary Group on Religious Literacy in the Media, which is a cross-party group which looks at how we can all work towards a greater public understanding of religion and explore the role of the media in bringing that about. We've just completed an inquiry into the religious literacy in print and broadcast media, which the Centre for Media Monitoring provided expert evidence and gave us some examples of misreporting and providing useful insight into potential steps forward. One of the key findings of our inquiry is that the way the media outlets choose to report on religion has a real quantifiable effect on the lives of people of faith. It distorts public understanding and leads to many social deep divides. So in 2018, I think many people here may be aware of it, Hope Not Hate in 2018 found that 32% of people surveyed believed that there were no-go areas in Britain where Sharia law dominates and non-Muslims cannot enter. Of course, in recent years, the issue of terrorism, which is subject of the discussion today, has come to play a particularly prominent role in the public's understanding of Muslims. While this is clearly that deserves coverage and debate, there had been suspicion for some time that the way attacks are discussed and reported on is often influenced by the race and religion of the perpetrator. This report, having looked at it, does an excellent job in substantiating and exploring that suspicion, provided detail through analysis of the disparities in coverage between different attacks and laying out the evidence in a fair and balanced way. I found that the report was also very thoughtful, sensible, and sensitive, especially some of the suggestions, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the discussion of the expert panel speakers today. And I just want to say, you know, thank you for the work that you've done. It's a great report and look forward to, as I said, hearing everyone's discussions.
Thank you, Yasmin, for your continued support. Next, I'd just like to give the floor to Faisal Hanif, who's the author of the report that we're going to be discussing. And Faisal's going to give a brief overview of the report and an insight into its findings. Faisal.
Thanks, Rizwana. Can everybody hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I thought I'd start off thank you for everybody for being here today, especially the panelists. I've not been able to thank, especially Rohit in person, because he did provide the foreword for the report. So I'm really appreciative of that. The origin of the report, it was one where one of the remits of the Center for Media Monitoring was to produce these sort of themed reports to look at an area of journalism in great depth. And that could have literally been anything, but we very quickly established, both through analyzing the level of coverage and also through the demand from essentially Muslim readers and viewers, that terrorism was almost an absolute necessity to cover, because not only was it the most frequent topic under which Muslims and Islam was reported, it was the one that seemed to get the most debate whenever a new story came out. And a good starting point for us was the very, very basic polemic that seemed to come out after almost every terrorist attack, or what was not designated as a terrorist attack, where Muslim audiences were saying, why isn't this person, or why isn't this a terrorist by the media? Why are they not calling them terrorists? And then sort of over the last few years, you've probably seen the reports that have come out in the media where some of the research that has been done by universities and academic departments, they sort of gave us a similar picture and a lead on this. So there was a University of Alabama report which showed that there was 357% more headlines in calling Muslims terrorists as opposed to white supremacists. I think a couple of years ago, AI Signal, a UK-based research department, they found that Islamists were, or what they termed as Islamists, were called terrorists 80% of the time, whereas the far right, the figure was less than 25%. So that gave us a sort of something to go on, and our statistical findings, which basically looked at where the word terrorism or terrorists was aligned with either Muslims and Islam, or aligned with descriptors of the far right, be it far right, neo-Nazi, or white supremacists. We also found this discrepancy. So the main figure being that it was 9 times as many, 9 times as frequent, the word terrorist or terrorism appeared alongside Muslims or Islam, as opposed to identifiers of white supremacy. Now, why is this the case? It's not necessarily a case of, well, there's 100 white supremacist attacks and 100 attacks by so-called Muslims, and therefore the coverage should be proportional. That's not quite how things work. And I think it's important to make that point. The major attacks on British soil in the last 20 years have been as a result of Daesh-inspired or Al-Qaeda-inspired ideologues. And those attacks have been deadly in the sense that a lot of people have died. So you've got Manchester Arena, 7/7, London Bridge, these major attacks. And the general rule in journalism is that when you have these attacks where a lot of deaths occur, you have wall-to-wall coverage, sometimes for months. And so, that means more columns, more editorials, more news reports, and therefore that would always skew the figure. So that's one aspect to remember. So in terms of these figures, it's not surprising that there would be more sort of coverage of terrorism associated with Muslims. But when we looked at specific examples, and these are shown in the report, especially when it's to do with attacks that haven't come to fruition, where the security services have got there in time and people have been arrested and they've been taken to court and they've been charged under terrorism legislation. The report shows very clear examples where the white supremacists have not been described as terrorists. and the Muslim potential perpetrator has been, which, I mean, I don't have a problem with the Muslim potential perpetrator being described as a terrorist, but the issue is one of consistency. So where you have two potential attacks, both aimed at the royal family, the headline on the Muslim individual was one of terror. The headline for the white supremacist was neo-Nazi Yob. So there was a major issue of consistency, and the more examples I looked at, the more I found of this. So whether that be terrorism that existed in Britain or in the US or further afield. So at that point, I sort of looked at different case studies, and the one I really want to mention is we looked at the comparison between two very similar attacks that took place at the end of 2018. One by a white supremacist in October 2018 in Pittsburgh, US, who burst into a synagogue and shouted, "All Jews must die," and murdered, I think it was 11 Jewish worshippers. The other took place in Melbourne a month later, where a Somali immigrant allegedly shouted Allahu Akbar. I don't think it was confirmed in the end that he did, but there was alleged use of a religious slogan. There was dramatic pictures. He stabbed people. He was eventually killed by the police. But the attacks were similar in the nature. There was a sort of ideological leaning there. There was apparently a religious or political slogan that was uttered. The police were on the scene. People died. And so there was similarities in these attacks, but the coverage was slightly different. So we measured, for example, the first 4 hours of the attack, and 14 out of 14 news reports on Melbourne described the perpetrator as a terrorist. Again, fine. I don't have an issue with that. I think a lot of people wouldn't. But when we looked at what took place in Pittsburgh, and when you had police on record saying that this guy went and did this and shouted, "All Jews must die," and shot dead worshippers in a synagogue, 4 out of 43 reports used one of the either terror, terrorism, or terrorist, and 3 of the uses of the word terror referred to the terror that the Jewish worshippers felt. So again, it was a really an issue of consistency here. And so by the beginning of 2019, we effectively had a report ready to sort of go. But at that point, we decided one of the other things that CFMM does is to hold these roundtables with senior journalists from the industry and who report on various topics. And we thought it would be a very good idea to take some of these findings to the people who effectively cover these things and have covered them over the years and who are the experts, to see what, whether we could gain some observations from them and whether we could find out why this was taking place. It was a fantastic event and really, really useful. And the report is actually littered with some of these observations that they gave. I want to particularly pick out 2, which really, was just startling for me. Especially this first one. So one of the correspondents I think he's been a journalist for 25 years plus, and he's covered a lot of these events. One of the real top news reporters in this country, in my opinion. He basically said to us that one of the things he no longer does is include witness statements in his reporting in the aftermath of a terror attack. And that was really startling to me as somebody who's been a journalist myself, because often journalists rely on these. That's the only thing they have to go with when they haven't witnessed something themselves. But he found in the course of his reporting of the years that people were basically regurgitating hearsay and were basically repeating things they'd already heard or something that had broken on the news that they've read on a sort of on the news app that they have. And they were starting to repeat this information to him. And he could basically no longer trust witness statements. And that was a really startling finding. But I think the events of last week, if anybody followed the news story that about a potential issue at the Eiffel Tower, the French police cordoned off the Eiffel Tower because apparently somebody had called in and said that he was ready to blow himself up or to attack people. And this was a potential incident that was in action. So what took place there was that you had a French journalist writing for a right-wing French magazine tweeted that one of his sources told him that this person who was allegedly at the scene had shouted Allahu Akbar, and he was threatening to blow the place up. And so he's tweeted this information. It's not been verified in any other way, but British news websites, some of them, took that information, headlined their news stories at 12 midday, and suddenly you had this breaking news story that there was this guy who shouted Allahu Akbar, was ready to blow himself up at the Eiffel Tower. And you had far-right individuals from the US, what's known as the Islamophobia industry, who took this up on Twitter. Allahu Akbar was trending on Twitter. And suddenly there's a news story here. 3 hours later, by 3 o'clock, those same news websites basically had a different headline, had a different take. Some of them acknowledged that the news they'd reported earlier was actually fake news and a hoax. Others just left it. They never mentioned anything. And so, even now that sort of behavior continues where the verification isn't there, the process of verification isn't there. It's just a rush to try and get anything out, irrespective of what that means. So that was one finding.
Faisal, you've got 2 minutes.
Thanks.
2 to 3 minutes.
But what the roundtable basically gave us, it gave us a lot of leads by which to expand the report on. So looking at, for example, the issue of Allahu Akbar and why newspapers are so desperate to headline their material with this. And I mean, one of the journalists there basically acknowledged that the media had effectively, or especially the tabloids, had effectively taken this everyday Muslim phraseology and made it into shorthand for terrorism. A lot of credit I think I need to pay tribute to Miqdad Versi, who set the Center for Media Monitoring up, because he's actually preserved a lot of these early examples from as far back as 2011, 2012. One of them is in the report from 2015, where you had Basque terrorists in Spain shooting in a supermarket, but somebody allegedly heard them shout Allahu Akbar, right? These Spanish Basque terrorists had shouted this. And again, British news sites as far back as then, they were so desperate to get this out that this is what they plastered on their websites, and suddenly, and if it wasn't for Miqdad, they wouldn't have ever changed it. So this was a major problem we found, an issue of religious literacy, which, because I haven't got time now, I'll probably go into when we discuss further. And then the report finishes off with a big section on what happened in Christchurch and how that was a major wake-up call for journalism and its inability over the years to tackle white supremacist terrorism or to even acknowledge the real threat of white supremacist terrorism. And I know Paul Spoonley's done, Professor Spoonley, I should say, has done some amazing work on this over the years, and I'm sure he'll go into this further. So back to you, Rizwana.
Okay, thank you for that, Faisal, and sorry for rushing you, but we've got so much to cover. John, if you can unmute yourself and turn your video on, I'm going to hand over to you to start off the panel discussion.
I think my video is on, but I don't know why it has.
We've just got a very beautiful still picture of you smiling, but you're not. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
No, that's it. You're on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Brilliant. Well, I'm incredibly impressed with the scale of this report, and I congratulate those who have put it together. I suppose if I had a criticism, I think there's nothing like enough online. I think the newspapers, we have to accept, are dying. The Daily Mail is read by half as many people as it was 10 years ago, and it'll be half again in 5 years' time, and probably dead soon after that. I mean, I'm not really predicting it, but I think it's perfectly possible. In the main, people are getting their information from other sources than newspapers and magazines. But of course, very often the online world is informed by articles that appear in magazines, etc. So of course, the report is extremely relevant. But I think next time round, we're going to have to concentrate very, very extensively on. I mean, I say this in part because I'm prejudiced by our own activities in the last couple of days in exposing the fact that Facebook played an active role in attempting to suppress the black vote, well, and succeeding in suppressing the black vote in America the last time Trump stood for the election. But having said that, I think, you know, we all need to read and inwardly digest this report and be very wary of the way we as journalists behave and the sort of stereotypical phrases that are apt to crop up, you know, if people aren't careful. And that illustrates, of course, that there is a residual, you know, underlying sort of habitual behavior, which is very well illustrated in this report. But I realize that we are running very late, and therefore I'm very happy to listen to other people speaking, and maybe we can chime in a bit later. So, Rizwana, the floor is yours. Maybe my video didn't work. I hope it did. Oh.
John, you're asking the question, so the floor is yours. We can't hear you though, you're muted. You've got to unmute yourself, John.
We have to do this 3 times a day for our own editorial meetings. So I've been driven mad by Zoom, but where would we be without it? Well, how shall we begin? Is Yasmin still with us?
Yeah, I think if we got a sense from the panelists, what, you know, how significant they think the report is and what are the main takeaways for them.
Who wants to come in on that from the panel? Volunteers. Otherwise, I'm going to press gang you.
I think if Rohit, you could start, if you unmute. So if I could ask Rohit, Frank, Jessica, Lizzie, Paul to unmute and put your videos on as well, please. Yep.
Rohit, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what John said there, actually. And, you know, I talked in the forward of this report about some of the instincts that you see in the reporting of news, in the reporting of terror attacks. And I use the example of the El Paso attack, which I reported in the US, where a white supremacist went into a supermarket during a holiday weekend and targeted Latino shoppers. And it was interesting. I was in the United States at the time, and watching the reporting there reminded me actually of where some of our news organizations were perhaps several years ago. In the first few hours of the sort of blaring breaking news on all of the rolling news stations, you know, the word terrorism was not mentioned. It took several days actually. And frankly, it was the British news organizations, which you could probably say with some pride, who were calling out what it was far before our US counterparts with their open-ended coverage gone for hours and hours and hours, dissecting every element of what had happened, but without actually at any point saying that this was terrorism. So yeah, I mean, you know, some of those problems still exist, and I think the report is an excellent piece of research. You know, the scale of it as well, but as John notes there, I think increasingly what we really need to be aware of is that in the scale of things, yes, there are problems that remain in what we might call the old media. But a lot of the narratives, the racist, the Islamophobic narratives, which dominate our discourse are increasingly coming from what people see on social media. And we're not talking about sort of extremist platforms. We're not talking about the sort of edges of the internet. What we're talking about here is what people see on Facebook and on Twitter. And of course, those organizations, those platforms use the excuse that they are not publishers or broadcasters like any of the news organizations we work for here. They say that they are merely platforms, merely carrying information from a poster to the public. And to me, my observation of the media landscape, but also from covering extremism and terrorism, is that yes, the old media needs to do much more, but actually a lot of the focus now and in the future should really be on what happens online. And I think media organizations are doing a much better job than they were in terms of sifting out bias, unconscious or otherwise, from fact. But the reality is, people who are friends with certain people on Facebook or who follow certain accounts will find that their view of the world, their view of an incident in the first few hours is really not shaped by the average person who we're imagining here, who might be looking at the BBC News app or tuning into Channel 4 News. So yeah, a fantastic and piece of research, but I'd add also that really I think our focus too should be on the online organizations that aren't represented here.
Thank you.
Frank, I wonder how this struck you, and indeed what you make of the comments that both Rohit and I have made about online, how they strike you.
Thanks, John. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh wa masakum al-khair to everybody. I absolutely welcome the report, and I welcome Faisal's very balanced and considered words, and also actually what Rohit has said as well there. The first few hours, as you well know, John, the first few hours after an incident are really tricky because, we work in this dreadful pressure house of 24-hour news where people expect comment, answers, details, which often aren't yet necessarily available. And I can think of very briefly 3 incidents where things on my patch in terms of security, terrorism had happened, and where the initial perception of it was very wrong. So the first one was Madrid in 2004. Bombs had gone off in suburbs of Madrid, and the Spanish government at the time was telling everybody it was ETA. They told the British government that, and MI5 put it out to journalists, well, we're going to go along with what they say. We think it's ETA. It took them several hours and I thought, this doesn't sound right. And of course it turned out to be Al-Qaeda. And the next was in 2007, when there was the Glasgow airport attack, where somebody rammed a vehicle full of what they hoped would be fuel air explosive, but it didn't actually ignite, into the doorways of Glasgow airport. And for quite some time, MI5, the security service, were dismissing, I think Sky said, we think this is a terrorist attack. They thought it was an accident. Actually, it was a Saturday, maybe it was the B team that were on duty. And they eventually called it right. And then most significantly in 2011, when explosions went off in Oslo, followed by multiple shootings, everybody thought this was probably going to be a jihadist attack. And it wasn't. It was Anders Breivik, a far-right extremist, a terrorist. And I think it's very important to kind of go back to the generally accepted, I know there is no one universal definition of terrorism, but the generally accepted definition is that it's when people use force or violence against their government or civilians in support of their political or social views. And that should be colorblind. Counterterrorism must be apolitical and it must be colorblind, which is why I think Rizwana actually tweeted something very nice about something that I said online, where I was referring to a far-right extremist attack. And I said on the news channel, I think, let's call this what it is. It's terrorism. It's just as much terrorism as the person who goes around knifing people and shouting the takbir.
Very handy. Thank you very much, Frank. That's a really enlightening contribution. Marvelous. Who wants to follow that? I'm wondering,
Lizzie?
Lizzie, why not? You'd be better
Hey
at it.
everyone. Thanks for having me on, and it's great to be here at this, very important time with the events we've seen in recent days. Looking at the report, I think it's really testament to how much has already changed in the UK media, but probably how much further we can go. I've been reporting on terrorism since 2014, which is nothing compared to some of my fellow panelists, but you would probably all be shocked to know how much has changed even in that short time. For instance, when I started reporting, the primary threat across the world was seen as coming from Al-Qaeda and ISIS-inspired attackers. Now, as we've discussed, there is a lot more understanding about the rising threat that emanates from the far right, but authorities have not necessarily caught up with that change internationally. And most media, not all, but most media will wait for the authorities in whatever country something is happening to formally declare something terrorism before making that call themselves. And that can be for a variety of ethical, legal, or stylistic reasons. And we can see that change in the UK. For instance, the Finsbury Park attack in 2017 was very quickly and rightly declared a terror attack by the Metropolitan Police. But just a couple of years before, the attempted beheading of a Sikh man by a neo-Nazi in a Tesco supermarket wasn't. So now a lot of counter-terror police privately admit that the Mould attack was a terror attack and would be declared one now, but at the time it didn't meet their threshold. And so even in that short period of a couple of years, we can see that great change. And although the authorities in the UK have now changed their stance and they claim to have a kind of ideologically agnostic declaration of what a terror attack is, that just hasn't happened in other countries. And I'd be interested to see whether the findings in the report would change in any way if other countries, particularly the US, changed their classification of shootings and attacks, and whether they were more willing to call non-ISIS related attacks terrorism, whether the media would follow.
Very interesting indeed. And Professor Paul Spoonley, I mean, you've spent a number of decades studying the far right and white supremacists. What drew your attention? Because it does seem to me that you were at it, as it were, but long before most of us in the media got to it.
Thank you, John. And can I, before I answer that question, congratulate Faisal and his colleagues at the Centre for Media Monitoring. I could have anticipated some of the broad themes of the report, but the details of it at times are deeply shocking. And I think, I hope that the media will take notice of them. John, I was a graduate student in Bristol, and I'm the son of British migrants to New Zealand, and I encountered an incident not far from where I was in Bristol, where a young Pakistani teenager was held on the ground in a swastika carved in his stomach with a razor blade by what were then National Front activists. And I was really very concerned that here was something that was held up to us in New Zealand as a liberal democracy, experiencing such direct and physical racism. And so it's been one of my academic journeys to look at these far right. And if I come to the broad issues of the media, I think there are two things that I would raise. One is the association of words. So we've now had, particularly in New Zealand and other countries, that Five Eyes emphasis on focusing on one form of terrorism to the exclusion of another. And I think that association with terrorism with Islam or Muslims is something that has become embedded not only in media reporting, but also in the public mind. But I think also there's an omission. And in the hours after the Christchurch shooting on the 15th of March 2019, wrote about our end of innocence in New Zealand, that somehow we were exempt. But that innocence was lost in so many ways. And I think one of the challenges that I have here in this, and I assume it's the same in the UK, is that we weren't told what the effects were of the reporting, but also the public opinion in terms of the effects on the Muslim community. And so we didn't know the way in which they were targeted. And I would like to come back to the online question in a moment. And I think the second is that we simply didn't associate the word terrorism with the far right. And so El Paso, Hanau, Christchurch, Norway should have reset that particular debate. And the report tells us that that debate, that reporting has not been reset. So there is still a major challenge for all of us.
Thank you.
Very good, excellent. And I'm wondering,
Dr. Jessica White, if
Yeah.
we could just bring.
Jessica,
Hi, thank you for having me tonight. It's nice to be on the panel with everyone. So I've been looking, I'm a research fellow at Royal United Services Institute, and I've been looking at the media as well, but from the perspective of a terrorism expert, not from the perspective of a journalist. And sort of in the process of this project, which is been funded by the Met Police, so it does come from the sort of terrorism side, counterterrorism side, looking at the impact that media can have, and potential negative and positive impacts, I think. But I think sort of a culture has been developed around terrorism, the concept of terrorism, especially in the Western world over the last 2 decades, in the post 9/11, world, where we've come to associate, society has come to associate terrorism with Islamist jihadi terrorism. And as sort of what Paul and Lizzie and everyone has been saying, that the media do play a role in informing the public and swaying public opinion on that, but the government and the counterterrorism frameworks also play a role, and they would shape how government or police would formulate communications, which they would then pass on to the media in an active environment. And the far right, the extreme right wing, is coming up on the agenda, and it is being framed as a recently rising to the forefront of the threat landscape, the conversation that's happening around security. But like Paula said, I mean, that threat has existed for decades. It's not new. It's coming back to the conversation, but it's certainly not a new threat. Unfortunately, though, however, I think there's a good argument to be made that over the last 2 decades, the legal frameworks have been built on the prosecution of foreign terrorist organizations because of the threat from Al-Qaeda and Daesh and the others, and that presents challenges to the prosecution and the investigation of domestic terrorism incidents. Additionally, I think much of the international agreements around counterterrorism have arisen out of that environment of the global war on terror, and the information and intelligence sharing agreements are challenged by the context of domestic terrorism and less easily identifiable networks and groups. The far right is known for being less organized and more individual in nature and very online in nature, and that challenges the way that it's talked about within counterterrorism policy, which then would filter down into the way that the media might report on it. I think all of those issues, even the issue of hate speech versus free speech and how to protect people and also protect their rights, it's very complicated, and it's wrapped up it's shaped the way government policy is looked at, it's shaped the way that media has represented these issues, and also shaped the general socio-cultural perspective on terrorism, and all of that would be a part of this conversation, and it needs to be a part of this conversation, and is highlighted in the report that's been done.
well, it's interesting because I think all of us who work in the media are pretty clear that the authorities very often don't get it right, or actually don't want to get it right. And I'd like to suggest that what has happened in the last couple of decades is the growth of think tanks and their very defined expertise and non-expertise. Because I mean, there are very, very good sources out there in all Western countries at any rate. And I'm wondering to what extent people are depending on them. Frank, do you see expertise that you can draw upon in what I would say the non-governmental sector?
Yeah, I do. there's some very good stuff that have come out of RUSI, out of the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. They've done a lot, for example, there on far-right extremism. IISS have done a bit on this. The Henry Jackson Society, which not everybody likes their sort of outlook. They tend to attack or be very critical of Russia and China. They've done actually quite a lot on far-right movements. They were one of the first think tanks to start holding, before we had COVID, they start holding face-to-face forums on this to really educate us about it. I think one of the difficulties with far-right extremism, and Rohit can perhaps correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's very hard to pin it down because there is no unifying ideology. They are haters. They hate everything and everybody. But whereas with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, there tends to be a unifying ideology. There is a leader, whether it's Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, there's somebody that people pay allegiance to. There is no comparison with far right. You know, there are some who are nationalists. There are people who think that there shouldn't be, there should be a stop to immigration. There are people who are anti-Semitic or simply just racist. But there is no one common denominator, and that makes it quite hard to pin down.
And Frank, I think you have to disappear fairly soon. Is there anything else you wanted to add in terms of the report? Anything else you wanted to throw in?
No, I didn't think so. I mean, I think it's really important, and that it's incredibly important that if we are going to report, we the media, fairly and be respected for our reporting, that we treat all cases on the same basis when it comes to terrorism, that there must never be any bias, which I think is what the report is basically hoping is going to be the effect, and I would agree with that. So unfortunately, we are going to see a great deal more, I fear, of far-right terrorism and acts of violence. It's still considered in numerical terms. In other words, there are fewer plots that the police and MI5 are chasing on the far-right spectrum compared to what's called international terrorism, ISIS and Al-Qaeda inspired, but it's rising. And I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet.
Frank, thank you very much, and thanks for being with us. And again, you trigger within me what we've been working on for the last 6 months, which is this unbelievable account of how Trump used all the powers of his campaign to denigrate and indeed to try and prevent from voting black voters. A collapse of 3.4 million votes from the black community from one election to the next. But anyway, thank you very much, Frank, indeed.
Frank, John, could I just ask Frank a question before he goes? And it's one that's come in from an audience member, but which kind of ties in with one of the questions we had, which is that given the evidence there of the inconsistencies that still exist within mainstream media, yes, it's acknowledged that online is far more problematic, but these inconsistencies do exist within mainstream media. Do you think that the war on terror narrative has become so entrenched within, the journalistic explanatory frames and narratives that the media find it hard to report outside of that framework? And what would it take to move away from that?
Well, I think that this awful phrase, the war on terror, or GWAT as it later became in American parlance, the global war on terror, it's completely outdated. I never liked it anyhow. I always refused to use that expression because it's like having a war on air. You can't have a war on a completely abstract concept. So it never really meant anything. And also, I think it tends to belong to the same rather black and white vision of President George W. Bush. If you're either with us or you're against us. And I would like to think that most journalists in the UK media, I can't speak for the US media, but most journalists in the UK media didn't really take up that expression. It was an American expression which was very much part of the zeitgeist, part of the spirit of the times of the early 2000s, the years immediately following 9/11. We'll smoke him out, we'll catch him, and all of that. And I think that it's really consigned to the history books. I've always been saying this for a long time, that you cannot package the Middle East or a religion or anything into one side or the other. There are many different shades, particularly in terms of opinion in the Middle East, for example. It's no good saying, what do the Arabs think about this? It's like saying, what do the Europeans think? I don't think the same way as somebody in Luxembourg thinks. So, you know, it's a prejudice that I've always fought against in my broadcasting, to stop stereotypical assignations to things of people saying, well, they all think like this, because everyone is different. Sorry, I'm slightly rambling there, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think yes, I think you're good. You're good. Now, listen, I want to take an outside question here. Irfan, do you want to put your question? Can you speak? Can we hear you or not? Let's hear. Irfan?
No, I think if you put the question, John, I don't think we can get hold of them.
Well, it's not really a question, but an observation, he says. We've come away from 50-50 journalism. The language used for BAME, and incidentally a phrase I hate, and Muslim is very different to other communities. So, Rohit, what do you think?
Sorry, just unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And, you know, actually one of the values of this CFMM report is actually, you know, it's one thing for me or a colleague to go and tell an editor that they think this is happening, to be presented with, you know, dozens and dozens of examples as the centre has done here, you know, actually helps back up that sort of claim. You know, like language is something that we use, you know, we review, we think about all the time. I don't think there is any area of reporting where it is, you know, our language is more consequential than it is than reporting on terrorism. And particularly in the aftermath of a terrorist incident or a suspected terrorist incident, or even worse, a suspected terrorist incident which turns out not to have been a terrorist incident. So yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Irfan.
Well, there's a very interesting question here. I mean, as leading journalists in your field, what influence and role do you have to facilitate change in language and application of consistency in relation to reporting of terrorism activities? Well, not as much as we might think we do. Who knows? Who else is online at the moment? Let's see who's still in. Jessica, do you have a view on that?
No, Jessica's on. What I was going to ask, if we can kind of move it forward, given that what, you know, Jessica said and what you've said as well, John, in terms of, you know, the police and officials not always being right. I wonder whether we could hear from Alexander Gent, who is from the National Association of Muslim Police, who look at, amongst other things, Islamophobia and terminology used within the police force. Alex, are you there? Can we bring Alex on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Good evening, Assalamu alaikum all. Yeah, so firstly, I'd just like to say, NAMP, we wholeheartedly support this report. I think the findings echo the sentiments of many of our members. A major concern for NAMP itself is we have a significant underrepresentation of Muslims within the police service. And from a NAMP perspective, broadly speaking, we feel there's a major lack of an understanding of Islam in general. So certain terminology can often amplify these issues. So if we talk about the words such as jihadist, Islamist, they throw negative connotations in relation to Islam and relating that to terrorism, which then subsequently stigmatizes many Muslims. This can be seen with the spike in Islamophobic hate incidents following terrorist attacks. We've had dialogue with the counter-terrorism policing and raised our concerns. So that's something we're discussing currently around terminology. And from an internal perspective, NAMP are in the process of conducting a survey to gauge the thoughts of our membership and their feelings on this topic.
And have you noticed, I mean, you're within the police force, and granted you're not with the counterterrorism police, but have you noticed discrepancies in the way that the police itself labels certain attacks as terrorist attacks and others as not?
Yes, I would say that many of our NAMP members do feel that there's a disparity. An example of this is the Lee Rigby attack, which was when it was reported as a terrorist attack, it was reported early on. Yet the attack on Joe Cox wasn't identified as a terrorist attack until several months later. Now, from a policing perspective, the actual counterterrorism unit, they were actually involved in the investigation of Joe Cox's murder from day one. So the issue really lies around the statement and the why that was reported, and why was it left until so much later, and why wasn't it publicly announced as a terrorist attack from the start? I know Lizzie already mentioned earlier on that things might have changed since then, but obviously the perceptions still remain.
I mean, we give lots of examples within our report of many attacks that involve vehicles, and as soon as the perpetrator has a Muslim name, it's deemed terrorism very quickly, and others, when they're attacks on Muslims attending mosques or whatever, they're either racist or xenophobic attacks. What kind of pressure are you putting on within the police force in terms of getting this right, as well as getting terminology right? Because obviously the media often follow the police's lead.
Yes, so I think, in my opinion, it's had a huge knock-on effect to the police internally for all Muslim members of staff and officers, and this is on a national basis. We've seen a lot of officers and staff suffer Islamophobia. This is, I think, partly due to banter, in inverted commas, which we see quite often, where Muslims are stereotyped as terrorists, and also we see the labelling of Muslims as being extremist if we see them practicing their faith, and again we've got several examples of that. These cases, as I mentioned, they're nationwide, and I think a few forces have now started to record hate incidents internally, which is obviously starting to help the situation, but there's no consistent approach, and there's still many forces that still don't record those incidents. So I think, unfortunately, we won't see this problem go away until there's a significant change nationally. And I hope the police really do take note of this report, because a lot of the recommendations, I think, will help things.
Brilliant, thank you. Rohit, you wrote an article following the murder of Joe Cox in 2016, when you said that some news organizations were reluctant to use the T word to describe the actions of her killer, and that they were wrong. What's changed in your organization, and what more do you think needs to be done?
Well, I mean, I'd say not much has changed in my organization, but in the sense that actually, because we're a fairly small team, it is a small number of people who are making those decisions. We're nowhere near as vast as, say, BBC News, and I think we made the right call that day. We were early to call it an act of terrorism, but as we've just heard, actually on that day, the police were very slow off the mark with the language, and there'll be a lot of criticism of media reporting tonight, but actually people should be aware that most news organizations are incredibly responsible, so responsible that actually, they're reluctant to throw around a word as powerful as terrorism until there is some level of confirmation from a police source on the record or off the record. I think what was different that day in the case of Joe Cox was, what it is the motive and not the method that defines something as terrorism. And it became fairly clear from the fact that here was an MP being killed outside her constituency surgery, combined with all the other things that we knew about that incident, that made it fairly clear that that terrorism was at the very least a possibility. So yeah, what's changed? I think people are far more conscious. I think people generally are more conscious of extreme right-wing terrorism in the UK. I think since then we've had a number of far-right groups prescribed, so named by the government as being terrorist organizations. So yeah, the conversation has changed, the narrative has changed as well. And I think when we look back to 2017, not long after the killing of Joe Cox, you know, there was some criticism of news organisations after the Finsbury Park attack, but actually, I think most reputable organisations were fairly quick off the mark to report that as, if not a terrorist incident, but a potential, a suspected terrorist incident. But, you know, viewers and listeners and readers should all remember that, you know, we're compiling a great deal of information. Things aren't always clear in the aftermath of an incident like this. You know, yes, we're listening to what eyewitnesses say on the ground, but we can't always rely on what's being said. You know, it is proven that sometimes eyewitness accounts can be unreliable. And so, you know, we're working out what the facts are, but we're also listening to, you know, what the authorities are saying, what the police are saying, what intelligence agencies are saying, and you know, what government sources are telling us as well. And it's our job to sort of conflate that picture to work out what we think is happening. But following a terrorist incident in the UK, perhaps more than any other news event, there is a great deal of caution which is exercised. And so what's changed since the killing of Joe Cox? I think we're all much smarter. We're all much more aware. We're all, you know, far more considerate about the fact that terrorism, you know, doesn't belong to a faith or a color or an ideology. I think newsrooms are far more aware of that generally. But it should also be remembered that actually, you know, there is a whole cocktail of factors that we draw in before we decide whether we're going to use language as consequential, as describing something as a terrorist incident or even a potential terrorist incident.
But as you know, there are other codes for terrorism, fundamentalists.
Yes.
There are sort of dirty words which are woven in, which
yes.
say really the same as terrorist, but
yeah.
don't commit the organization to actually having to develop a defense of the word terrorism.
No, absolutely. I mean, I can't remember an example in any of the recent terrorist attacks in the UK where we have used words like extremist, fundamentalist, before we've used the word terrorist. But you're completely right. You know, there are sort of proxy words, I guess, and I'm lumping them all together, frankly. They're all part of the same sort of, you know, dictionary of words that mean essentially the same thing.
I'd like to pick up on something that you've said, Rohit, and maybe bring Lizzie in here as well, that you say that journalists are very cautious about before they use the word terrorist. But as our reporters found, as numerous studies have found, the media still disproportionately refers or uses the word terrorism more frequently when, you know, the person is identified as being a Muslim.
Yeah.
So why is there that level of inconsistency? What, it can't just be that on those occasions you've only followed the official line, because surely, you know, you can't always follow the official line. So why is there still this inconsistency and disproportionality?
Yeah, well, but I guess that's part of my point, Rizwana, in that actually, you know, police forces themselves also need to look at the way that they communicate following terrorist incidents, suspected terrorist incidents, because if we compare some of the incidents of the last few years, they have generally been slower to offer clarity when a white supremacist launched an attack for whatever reason, and perhaps there are other reasons. But you're right. You're right. I mean, as I suggested before, though, we can't speak of the media as one homogenous block. You know, newspaper websites are very different to newspapers in print, and are very different to Ofcom regulated public service broadcasters, and are very different in turn to some of the online only organizations, you know, where a lot of people are getting their news first, and where a lot of the most, let's say, sort of dodgy reporting on this front actually comes from. But yeah, there is a problem. There is a sort of wide-scale, industry-wide bias and prejudice, which comes from, you know, which comes from a range of reasons, I guess. But you know, I think it's important to sort of to call out the journalists, the organizations specifically, because, you know, there are many of us who are doing work to try to ensure that this doesn't happen. But yeah, no, there is absolutely a problem. But I guess my point is that we take it into account a mixture of facts. And one of them is the official information that is coming from police sources. And actually, you know, I think if you look back at a lot of the reporting, yes, you know, there are dozens and dozens of examples in the report. But actually, if you look at a lot of the reporting that follows terrorist incidents, you know, the general trend is that actually news organizations, more often than not, take their lead from the police. And yes, they use this sort of shadowy language or proxies, as you know, the sort of words that John refers to. But you know, there's a shared responsibility here, shared between the media, but shared also with law enforcement agencies as well.
Lizzie, do you think there should be a shift away from just relying on that? And sadly, you know, Sir Harold Evans passed away this week, and he was one of the, you know, giants in the industry who was not only just an investigative journalist, but kind of held, you know, truth and power to account, but also was a stickler for facts and evidence. And one of the other things that we've found, and we've kind of elaborated on in the report, is the whole reliance on unreliable and uncorroborated witness statements. You know, and we've found many newspapers falling into that trap.
Yeah, so it is a complicated picture. Or there's some feedback because someone's not on mute. Sorry. But yeah, there is a complicated picture. Like Rohit says, we have to balance all of those sources. And that has created what some people would say is an over-reliance on what authorities say in any given country. So in the UK at the moment, at this very time, that seems broadly okay because they are dealing with different kinds of terror attacks quite well. But in the US, that has the consequences we've seen, where attacks that might appear plainly to be terrorism under most international definitions aren't labeled like that. So it's a very difficult choice for news outlets between following a official declaration or definition that they might not agree with ethically, or trying in the aftermath of what might be a very complex, deadly attack where the witnesses, as we've said, might be unreliable, going out of the way themselves to make a call which might have huge implications and later be wrong. And fundamentally for me, I think one of the key issues that would take a lot longer to talk about is that there is no really agreed definition of what terrorism means. It's an incredibly powerful word. Several different countries, including the UK, have defined it in statute. But even though those definitions are there, that hasn't necessarily trickled down to the general public. So for me, the issue isn't even just that the word terrorism is used inconsistently. It's also about asking ourselves, what do we mean by that word? What do readers think we mean by that word? Because I think if you ask the average person in the street what terrorism was, you might get a lot of different answers.
Well, I mean, there is a very, a very interesting point here. And I've been thinking about Northern Ireland. We never described Christian terrorism, and yet there was extensive Christian, still is some Christian terrorism to be had. And our preparedness to lumber a particular religion with particular activities seems to be perfectly okay as long as we think it's foreign. And that, I'm afraid, is one of the prejudices. Northern Ireland teaches us that actually the British were never prepared to be as candid about Christian terrorism as they seek to be, or they appear to seek to be, in terms of terrorism that might have anything to do with the Muslim community. And that is the danger of ever using religious handles to simply, identify a certain kind of action or activity. The other thing I think is worth pointing out is that the mainstream media has become more diverse. There's no question. I mean, it's awkward to sit in a news conference in an organization and start drumming into Muslim terrorism, if in fact there are actually quite a number of Muslims in the room. And that is beginning to achieve change, without a doubt. I mean, I know this excellent report picks out terrible offences across the spectrum, but I do believe there are grounds for hope. I mean, when I first started in the media, there were no Muslim correspondents or even people in the newsroom at all. That was only 30, 40 years ago. Now there are, and they are much more diverse. And it goes for race as well. So I mean, it's very easy to be very depressed by this report. Actually, I'm uplifted because of its clarity. But at the same time, we need to recognize that there are the seeds of hope knocking around in newsrooms across the country. I'm still, and I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, really, really worried about the malign and evil forces that are existing and really using the social network to push their particular views and slanders.
I know this might seem like a kind of a media bashing discussion, but it's not meant to be. We hope that we are kind of highlighting issues that you're grappling with as well. And, you know, we're just discussing them. It's not about kind of bashing the media in any way. It's about working together to ensure that we kind of uphold the standards of journalism in terms of accuracy and responsibility. I wanted to bring in now, John, if you wanted to speak to Mohammed Kosba, who I think it would be useful to speak to people who've been at the receiving end from the media. So Mohammed Kosba is the chair of Finsbury Park Mosque. And
there is an institution, there is a place that has suffered appalling abuse at the
absolutely.
Reporters and indeed media outlets. And Mohammed, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I wonder if you want to kind of talk to us a little bit about what you have learnt in your tenure at the mosque about the way in which things had happened in your parish, as we would call it, are reported by the media.
Well, thank you, John and Rizwan. Actually, as you know, we at Finsbury Park Mosque, we went through very difficult and challenging time before 2005, when Abu Hamza and his supporters hijacked the mosque and for their own agenda. And in 2005, the situation changed. A new management, new trustees became, and this mosque is become a hub for the community, not just only the Muslim community, but the wider community as well. It is not just only a mosque now, it is a community center which open for everybody. Despite all this hard work, by the way, we won a few awards during these years, which being recognized nationally and locally. Despite all this hard work, we still subject to Islamophobia, to attacks from different level, especially from some of the media, I don't want to say all the media, but some of the media, it seems like no Muslim organization allowed to be successful, to have successful stories and cases. It's not allowed for any Muslim organizations to be a role model or an example for its own community, and especially the young people. Any potential Muslim organizations who become successful should be undermined and should be destroyed. The media is the best tool to do that. Actually, it should be destroyed in the eye of the public and also the establishment. We see how many politicians avoid coming or visiting Muslim organizations, mosques, and other charities, for example, because they don't want to link themselves with them, because I mean, they are, of course, scared from especially the media to attack them and destroy their career. And also the same things for public figures. So therefore, as in Muslim organizations, we have to be very careful how to deal with these matters. We need to be, from my experience, actually, I learned that engaging positively with the media is very important. We have a very good friends in the media at the moment. We engage with many of them throughout these years. And I know from experience, if we don't give our own story to the media will go and get their own story from Google, from other sources, which will definitely have a negative impact on this particular organization. So many Muslim organizations, unfortunately, they don't work positively with the media because they are scared from whatever background they've got about the media. We, as Finsbury Park Mosque, we've been through many libel cases. Actually, we've been we went through 4 of them, 3 which we won, and 1 still under ongoing one, which I cannot speak about. But one personally about myself as a chair of the mosque by Andrew Gilligan and the Daily Telegraph, when they accused me that I blame the UK for ISIS establishment and the creation of ISIS, and they as well blame me for attack me for they said that I called for the destruction of Israel, which is as well is not true, and other accusations, which we have to take it seriously and take action against them. And the good thing that I advise all the Muslim organizations that the way forward at the moment, when they've been attacked by the media by allegation which is not true, defamations, they go through the legal action. And in this country, we have a very good system which give you the opportunity to defend yourself and win cases. And this is what's happened with us with WorldCheck, Thomson Reuters, with Daily Telegraph, with Policy Exchange, and others, which we take action against them. So it is important to fight back, not to give up and leave this matter, but fight back and be example for other organizations to take the same steps.
Thank you very much for that. Not everyone obviously has the financial means to fight libel cases, but it is one of the past. And we've got another mosque here and 2 other contributors from Hizra Mosque in Manchester. Do we have Sajjad and Nadia there?
Yes.
Which involved a number of scout groups, and including the 466 Manchester Scouts group based in Hizra Mosque in Manchester. The Daily Telegraph again published an article entitled "Second Scout Volunteer Suspended and More Groups Referred to Police Amid Extremism Concerns." All of this which was completely false. We have Sajad Amin here, who's the chair of the Scouts group and a trustee at the mosque, as well as Nadia Zeb, who was one of the main Scout volunteers at the time. Sajad, why do you think that a Scouts group would be accused of extremism?
I'm not sure to this day as to why they would reach that conclusion. Unfortunately, they never provided any such information. It was a very, very poorly researched article that provided no evidence, but did make a load of assumptions that were all unfounded against the hardworking volunteers of various Scouts groups across the country and mosques such as ours that are real hubs in the community. I mean, our mosque, Kisra Mosque, Kisra Mosque in Manchester, was awarded the Be Proud Award Manchester in 2017 following the terrorist attack in Manchester. Now, we, you know, for the work that we did in the community, helping those that were in need. Now, we were never approached for our comments before the piece was published, and we were shocked actually to learn about it. All the accusations against us were false and made up. There was never any police involvement. There was never any Scouts co-ed policy that they referred to. And at the time, there was no single-sex scouting at our centre either. So, you know, maybe following in the ways of Robert Baden-Powell and the Scouting tradition was extreme. Maybe tying knots and playing games was extreme. Maybe children coming together for the Scouting experience was extreme. I have no idea as to why they did, but they did, unfortunately.
Now, I mean, you secured an apology from the Telegraph on page 2 and they removed the original article online. Do you think that erased the damage that they'd done to your reputation?
If only it was so simple. Sadly, it isn't. The pressure on the group, on Scouts group, the volunteers, the parents and the mosque, as a result of this article was immense. Whilst the Telegraph eventually did remove the article and issued a full apology, other news outlets actually copied the article and it still remains online elsewhere. Thankfully, the Scouts Association, the local community were very supportive, but it was a very difficult time when we were dealing with this matter.
Nadia, are you there? Because I know you're...
Yeah.
Yeah, can you just tell us what the experience was like for you, the Scout members and the families?
Yeah, I mean, just to go off what Sajad has said, that it did have a great impact on me and the Scouting community within the mosque. As like Sajad said, we are a big hub and it's a community place where communities come together. The lie spread, it put me in a difficult position. I was forced to defend myself and the integrity of the organisation, and based on lies. The young people, the volunteers that were working with us, they also became a bit reluctant and felt uneasy about all these rumours that were spread. I mean, Scouting, it's a voluntary basis and it's immensely rewarding. It's time that we give to the younger generations, trying to build better opportunities for them, trying to build a better future. And we hope that the next generation would move away from Muslims and the bad press that goes with it and the stigma that's currently attached to Islam. However, when these lies are always spread, this just becomes a little bit more difficult. We would try to recruit more volunteers, but as you're recruiting them, and if they saw the article, they were a bit more reluctant to come forward. They just thought they were put under a microscope and under more scrutiny, and were worried and unduly concerned about having every move watched, and worried that their actions would be misinterpreted and falsely reported. It did become, again, like Sajad said, it was a difficult time, and we came together, and we're thankful that the Scouting organisation backed us up and knew there was nothing involved.
Thank you for that. Lizzie and Rohit, and also Paul, if you can, I suppose, what do you think should happen to journalists who frame ordinary citizens in this way? And, you know, are there ramifications of an apology or a fine enough, or does having kind of serial offenders, and there are serial offenders within the media amongst certain outlets who we've seen, and particularly in the right-wing press, do they tarnish the media as a whole? And what should happen to these people? How should they be held to account by, you know, by their peers, by the regulators? Yeah, I suppose that's the question.
Oh, if you don't mind, Rohit, I'll just give a quick rundown of the kind of regulation landscape. In the UK, I'm sure everyone's aware of the Leveson inquiry about a decade ago now, in the wake of various phone hacking scandals and the closure of the News of the World. After that, the UK government backed a new press standards organisation, but there are a lot of issues around the way it was formed, its remit. Basically, a lot of newspapers opposed it. So they formed another voluntary regulator called IPSO. So there are now two separate regulatory bodies in the UK, and several outlets, including The Independent, aren't actually a part of either of those. So although most of us follow a similar code of practice, the one that currently is circulated by IPSO, the means of regulation do vary a lot. So that's kind of the first stumbling block there. And the second one is that the kind of allegations that Mr. Cosbar talked about do violate libel laws, and that can be dealt with through the courts completely separate to any kind of arbitration process. But that is very expensive and very stressful to do, and involves kind of people putting themselves out there and their private lives. So people are often quite reluctant. So to be honest, there is a gap in terms of accountability for mistakes or kind of malicious reporting. And to be honest, it doesn't just apply to these issues, it actually does apply across the board. And that's an issue that I think a lot of people have experienced.
But I once again resort to the way things are changing online. And it is possible for us to call out this sort of stuff online and really get traction. I mean, the newspapers no longer have the world to themselves. And indeed, they are a fading force, as I've said right at the beginning. And whilst this report is incredibly important because it highlights precisely what is going on as a sort of institutional activity, the truth is that they will not be the dominant force they were even 5 years ago, even now. And in another 5 years, they will be even more withered.
It is, if you allow me, it is important to mention that we approach IPSO when Andrew Gilligan wrote about myself and the mosque. And unfortunately, we didn't get what we need to get. We've been forced to go to take legal action, actually, because we didn't get the apology from the Daily Telegraph and to remove the article as well. So we've been forced. Sometimes, you have no other option except going that route. And yes, it is very stressful, very expensive. But I mean, this it's worth sacrificing some time. That because this is the only option we've got as a Muslim community. We have no other options to go. If IPSO can take all the all the complaint from us seriously and do something about it, I think we don't need to go that route. But this is, I mean, in my case at least, it didn't happen. Just only an example as well, when the terrorist attack happened in Finsbury Park. Usually in these circumstances, the public shows solidarity and sympathy with you. Unfortunately, some of the media try to link our mosque with what's happened before 2005 and when Abu Hamza was there. I mean, during this crisis, when there is a terrorist attack against Muslims, and some media start talking about the area and that it is very close to Finsbury Park Mosque, where Abu Hamza before 2005 was in control. What this has to do with that, I don't know, but it shows that, I mean, people want, I mean, whoever try to do that, they want to cut the public sympathy and solidarity with our community and with our mosque. And this affect the whole of the community. It is like tarnishing the whole of the community, the reputation, the credibility, and so on, and try to label them as terrorist or extremist, which is very serious. And these sort of things should be stopped by the media. And I hope that, I mean, from what we heard today, it's really very, very encouraging and very positive.
We've got John, I'll just read out a question from one of the panel, from one of the attendees. And it kind of links on to possibly moving forward. We've looked at all the problems, but maybe let's look at whether there are changes afoot. And they're asking whether the journalists think that the immediate positive action taken by the New Zealand government and Jacinda Ardern when the Christchurch attack happened has actually, you know, led to some kind of changes. And it would be good to bring Faisal in here as well, because obviously there's a huge section on Christchurch as a possible turning point. But maybe if Rohit and Lizzie and John, if you answer that, and then we bring Faisal in, because yeah, I think there was some change afoot.
Well, I mean, should I go first?
Why not?
One of the things that actually the Prime Minister of New Zealand said, actually, following the attack was she was calling out Facebook and the social media companies, and actually it was a turning point in that sense as well, in that she I forgot her phrase exactly, but she said, you know, that companies like Facebook see themselves as just being the postman. And I think, yeah, it was certainly a turning point in terms of the way that these attacks are sort of classified in the instincts of journalists, certainly. But perhaps one of the other significant things to come out of that incident was having the leader of a nation highlighting the role that was played, and she was talking about the ability of the attacker to actually broadcast, you know, some of his video online. But actually, you know, this bleeds into the issue of media reporting as well. And I really think that Christchurch was a turning point in part because of, you know, the seniority of the attack, which came on the social media companies straight after that. And look, I think she was right in highlighting that, and she was perhaps a little fearless, because, you know, it's one thing taking on some newspaper proprietor or you know, a TV station, but taking on the sort of Silicon Valley giants with turnovers the size of small countries, is significant. So yeah, I mean, it was a turning point in many ways, but we should also highlight that because you know, that's clearly where this discussion will be going over the next few years, and we may well remember Jacinda Ardern's intervention on that issue as being among the most significant.
Paul, you were there, obviously, you're in New Zealand and you've studied this quite clearly. Was it a turning point? And, you know, I know you've spoken about the fact that it came as a surprise to most New Zealanders about, you know, white supremacist attacks, but that you had, you know of at least 70 organizations that exist, or individuals. But what was Christchurch from your point of view?
Well, I think it was a turning point, but to build on what Rohit said, what I think we focused quite a bit on the way in which the police categorize, and therefore the media then follow up that categorization. What happened very rapidly in New Zealand was political leadership, and I mean that with a capital P as well as a lowercase p. And so Jacinda Ardern immediately came out with that, you're one of us. Now, we might argue with the terminology, the sort of othering of the Muslim community in this case, but her sentiments were very clear, and her empathy and instructions were very clear. And one of the interesting things that followed that was that the shooter appeared in court and made a white power gesture with his hands. And suddenly it was realized that the media could misrepresent or amplify some of the racist ideologies of the shooter. And so an agreement was reached with all the media, between the government and the media, about what would be reported or how it would be reported. And that was critically important when it came to the sentencing of the shooter. So there was an agreement in place between the New Zealand government and the media. So I think that's really, really important. But the issue very rapidly, and I want to build on what Rohit said here, very rapidly became the proliferation of voices and the inability to deal with what was happening online. So the Prime Minister and Emmanuel Macron developed the Christchurch Call, which was to try and invite the online platforms to join the party in terms of limiting Islamophobic comment. But I must say that it's had some limited success, but the issue is that the online territory is both a force for good, but in this case, it is really an area which misrepresents, which is hostile, which contributes to hate speech and hate crime. And I think we're all struggling to know what we do about this new media, the online media, in addition to the more traditional mainstream media, which might be more amenable to those agreements that occurred in New Zealand. But it's the proliferation really of those voices online, which is deeply problematic in the New Zealand, and I would suggest internationally.
Well, Paul, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, and I think that's, again, looking to the future on this. This is the challenge. The challenge is to begin to reckon with these online entities. Facebook is so big, as has been pointed out already, but as I said right at the beginning of my contribution, I mean, we in the last 24 hours have broken this story on Channel 4 News as to the extent to which Facebook facilitated what the Trump campaign wanted to do in 2016, which was to suppress the black vote, and went at it hammer and tongs, and they have never been held to account. And it's very difficult to know how national entities that are smaller than Facebook itself are ever going to be able to deal with this. And therefore, it's a global issue, one for the United Nations, if only it could pull itself together again, to tackle. We, the media, need to be very conscious of the fact that one of the reasons that Facebook gets away with it is because we ourselves are dependent upon it for so much of what we do. We use Facebook to publicize what we're doing, and we should stop. We should actually use other social networks, and there should be a campaign to bring Facebook back into line.
And just to go back to the point about Christchurch and what it changed, for me, it was a wake-up call in many ways, but I think for a lot of people around the world who hadn't been aware of or had underplayed for whatever reason the threat of right-wing terrorism, it really showed how wrong they were. And of course, it shouldn't have taken that long, and it shouldn't have taken that many deaths, especially after the Norway massacre, the shootings in the US. In the UK, we had the bombings by David Copeland, who was a neo-Nazi back in the 90s, but people have very short memories. So what I'd seen in the UK anecdotally, particularly on social media, was a lot of apologism, either people who were because they were also extreme themselves, or because they'd misread things online or consumed misinformation, honestly didn't believe that there was a far-right terror threat in the UK or in other countries. And after Finsbury Park, I'm sure a lot of you will remember there was a very strong narrative, a completely fake narrative, that Darren Osborne hadn't murdered the victim Makram Ali, that Makram Ali had had some kind of heart attack and Darren Osborne was drunk or mentally ill or not capable, and he certainly wasn't a terrorist, or at least that was the narrative. And until Christchurch, I would still regularly see in the comments section of any article I wrote about far-right terrorism, people just flat out denying that it was a threat, people claiming that people were being prosecuted because they'd said something nasty on Facebook, or because they were mentally unstable, or because the government was launching some kind of politically correct crackdown. And Christchurch blew all that away in an absolutely horrific way. And I think maybe there are a lot of extremists who won't have changed their opinions, but there are a lot of members of the public who were perhaps just very ill-informed, who were then made aware of the scale of the threat that the far right presents around the world.
And I think part of what was so undeniable to those people about Christchurch was the fact that this attacker had constructed this sort of, so-called manifesto, and so it was undeniable. But reflecting on what Lizzie said, so much of the commentary that followed previous attacks, the denials of what happened, in my experience, on the newspaper comment sections, reflect often word for word sort of fake news narratives that you see on where else but Facebook. And that is the sort of incubator for a lot of this misinformation, which is spread deliberately by, goes full circle. It begins with people on the extreme right wing who go out of their way to excuse any act committed by extremist terrorists on the extreme right. They're the same people who will start false narratives. Remember the fire at Notre Dame, in Paris. In the early hours, there were hundreds and hundreds of posts which originated from people on the far right, who talked about reports of a Muslim link, of an attacker being seen leaving the scene, shouting Allahu Akbar, and all of these things were before anyone in the sort of what's now called the mainstream media could work out what was going on. These narratives were already being spread rapidly, and it's interesting, even weeks afterwards, people who I know who aren't in journalism or politics, still appeared to believe that was what happened. And that's because they saw a friend of theirs from school repost something, or they saw something crop up on Twitter. And so, we as journalists need to be much better. But we should also not ignore the sort of broader, greater, deeper threat behind us, which comes from this sort of Wild West, where extremists of all types can spread fake narratives, which get around the world in seconds before a proper journalist can get on the phone and work out fact from fiction.
Can I just bring Faisal in here? Because I know earlier on, John, you spoke about, think tanks, and Faisal in his report has spoken about the Islamophobia industry. And Frank Gardner mentioned the Henry Jackson Society, who'd done quite a lot of extensive research on, the far right, but they're very well known as well for having a very anti-Muslim, Islamophobic take as well. And there's many people, and within the coverage around Christchurch, I think there was a lot of evidence to show, as far as broadcast media was concerned, that there was a lot of platforming of the far right or organizations that, have far right views and are very anti-Islamic, and yet they were being brought on as experts, and without being challenged or without being given a context as to who these people are and what their views are. Faisal, I just wondered whether you could expand on that.
So it wasn't just after Christchurch. I mean, it seems to be a staple of almost every terrorist attack. So
you're a bit quiet,
especially
Faisal.
when
If you
it's
can speak
a terrorist
louder.
attack that's committed.
If you can
Sorry,
speak a bit louder.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems to be a staple of almost every terrorist attack that's committed by a Muslim. The sort of default position of a lot of sort of newspapers and even some broadcasters is to go to these people who claim themselves as experts within this area, but a lot of the evidence, and I encourage people to actually look at the Twitter feed of Miqdad Versi, because he again has sort of detailed this evidence where, in reference, for example, to the Henry Jackson Society, who have gone out to their way to deliberately target certain Muslims and have spread certain information about Muslims over time, which he's detailed, which is simply sometimes not true and sometimes very, it's very targeted. So why journalists and newspapers seem to end up going towards these sort of people is anybody's guess, especially when you have authentic sort of Muslim scholars who you could approach for a commentary or to get an opinion on something. That's a really problematic element. There's also people from within what I term as like the security industry who have some really horrific views on Muslims and Islam. And it's not just your standard opposite. I mean, I understand people have a right to oppose a religion, but if you actually look at some of their views over time on social media, the idea that an objective journalist would go to these people to get a view on Muslims or Islam, especially after a terrorist attack, is, I think, very, very problematic. And I think Muslims, the evidence we found in the report, and Muslims have sort of pointed this out over time, is really calls into question the credibility of some of this sort of reporting. So, I mean, that's a sort of huge problem, and I hope going forward it's sort of, journalists are sort of aware of this, when they are reporting and looking for comment. And I mean, in terms of post Christchurch, what I would say, I mean, Christchurch was a real shock, I think, across the sort of industry. And you saw in the early days where you had, the Daily Mirror came out with their front page about the angelic boy the next day, and Newsnight had a member of Generation Identity on, and there was a huge sort of backlash against this kind of reporting, certainly within the Muslim communities, because it was almost like, look, what more evidence do you need? This, we've been saying for years, this is a major threat against us, and now you've got this. But I think from sort of my analysis, the point where I saw real change, I think, was, and Rohit's mentioned, and also Lizzie referred to issues with authorities labeling people as terrorists, was the El Paso attacks. Because I think for years, and I don't know whether this has changed, but for years there wasn't an offense of domestic terrorism in America. So even when you had white supremacists commit these sort of acts, they were never charged under terrorism legislation, or there was no legislation to charge them under that. So they were never referred to as terrorists. But increasingly, when El Paso took place, you had journalists, you had commentators on mainstream news channels who were coming out and saying, look, this is terrorism. Let's not get away from this. This has all the hallmarks of terrorism. Whether the US government wants to designate it as terrorism is not really the point here. This is terrorism. And I think some of the methodologies that I've sort of worked with within the report, I think they can sort of be applied to future events. And I mean, I hope there's no future events, but as Frank mentioned earlier, there probably will be. And I think it would be, anybody could sort of analyze those future events and the news sort of coverage to see whether there has been this sort of improvement. To give you one practical example, I know there's a question that John alluded to earlier about the responsibility of senior journalists in all of this. One of the journalists who attended our roundtable in June 2019, one of the reports he did later on about a case of terrorism within the prisons in the UK, he within that report, the prisoner was shouted Allahu Akbar before he launched the attack on the officer, which was a fact, and he reported it as a fact that this is what happened. But he also included a line in there to mention how this phrase was the ordinary phrase used by Muslims within prayer and everyday activity, but had been co-opted by terrorists for their own usage. And even something as small as that, it gives really good context to the reader as to, to move away from the idea that this is a terrorist phrase and the terrorists own this, the takbir, which has been there since the onset of the Muslim religion. I know a lot of people take a lot of offense when it is reported as a terrorist phrase. So I think that, and just something like that, I think is really is appreciated, and I think sort of lifts the standard of reporting across the board.
Well, Rizwana, there we are. We've hit the witching hour of 10 o'clock. I don't know whether you want to wrap things up or how you wish to proceed, but I think it's been a very, very good discussion. I feel we were very blessed to have such a diverse and interesting number of contributors. Rohit, who played a starring role, and Paul especially, very good to get your take, and Frank Gardner, and of course you yourself, Faisal.
And Lizzie.
And Lizzie, of course, and Lizzie. But I mean, many to mention, but how do you want to close the proceedings?
Yeah, I mean, I think if people, you know, Faisal has made some recommendations in the report, and I just wondered whether very briefly, you know, the panelists think very briefly whether that's a way forward of you know, maybe implementing some change, and then we will wind up after that. Lizzie, Rohit?
Yeah, for me, it's a really interesting way of starting a discussion with our editors. It sounds like a get out clause, but you know, newsrooms are dictatorships, not democracies, and it is good to have a kind of concrete base in research to say, you know, actually there is an issue, here are some proposals, and use that as a starting point. And I think a lot of news outlets, even if they wouldn't necessarily end up adopting all the recommendations, would find that a really useful way to start a serious conversation that's backed up in evidence.
Yeah, I agree with Lizzie. You know, newsrooms and news organisations have to be independent and have to do their own thing, and you know, and that should be the right thing. But you know, to have this document is a really solid and credible piece of research to not only contribute but perhaps even change the conversation.
I think with 35 days to go to the vote in the United States, recommendation 11, white supremacist voices should only be platformed if their views can be adequately contextualized and challenged. Gosh, well, Donald Trump has said a few things in the last few months of campaigning that are going to bring that one into play. But there we go. We can.
Yep, just Paul, and then we'll wind up.
Well, in the New Zealand context, I'm on a working group that is hosted by the New Zealand Police, which considers whether hate speech or hate crime is part of any reporting of any crime. And so I've shared the report with them because I think the audience is not simply the media, it's those that influence the media. So the other group that I would really like this to go to and to be the subject of discussion is amongst our political leadership. And I mean that by that, the community leadership, but also our political leaders. The final thing I would say is that I think it's really important to both educate and regulate. So part of the problem is that our regulations are not up to the task, but I also think we need to improve media literacy. And of course, that includes all sorts of literacy, including online literacy, so that people can then exercise judgment in terms of what they're seeing in front of them.
Paul, are you speaking to us live from New Zealand?
Yes, I am.
My God, I think you get the badge of honor tonight.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank first and foremost John, our chair, all our panelists, contributors, and the audience for having taken the time to discuss what I think everyone will agree is a really, really important issue. I hope everyone has taken a little away from it, from the discussion, and that it's the beginning of a process of dialogue amongst, you know, various institutions, the media, the police, you know, politicians, as Paul has said, but that it's a starting point, and that we hope that it will lead to a shift in the change in which you know, Muslims and Islam are portrayed, especially when it comes to terrorism, conflict paradigms, and the othering of Muslims. We hope that that changes. Centre for Media Monitoring will continue to engage constructively with the media, with regulators, with all stakeholders, and we hope that, you know, change is afoot. We've spoken a little bit about diversity. We have another event on Thursday this week, which is Meet the Media, where we bring together editors and Muslim organizations to talk about issues of inclusivity, whether it's within, you know, how many Muslim staff and BAME staff there are there, but also in terms of the kind of stories that are covered and perspectives. So that's another event that will be taking place. In the meantime, once again, thank you everyone for joining. Sorry for the late start, and thank you for everybody's contributions.
And thank you,
and
thank you for putting it together, and thank you, Faisal, for giving us the material to work on. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.